Okay, hi everybody, good afternoon. My name's Fiona. If you haven't been to one of my webinars yet, this is me. I started my career with Teach First. I've taught French and Spanish all the way through from primary to A-level. I write a newsletter which shares recent target language news stories, and I'm head of A-level here at Languagenut, having just completed my master's in comparative education. Obviously, I'm head of language. I'm head of A-level at Languagenut, but I will be sort of talking about sort of key stage 3 through to 5 today, so it won't all just be focused on A-level. So that's me. Just a quick plug, we've obviously had a really busy term for webinars. Some of you might have already attended a couple of them. So these are the webinars that we've done so far this term. This one today is part of a 3-part series on sort of how to make your teaching more adaptive. My colleagues Brian and Emma did last week the webinar on adapting your teaching to support all learners. If you want to access any of these, if you want to have a look at the recordings, or if you want any of the resources, do feel free to visit the website, Languagenut website. We have a webinar section, and if you want this PowerPoint at the end of today, you can see these links that I've put that you'll be able to have a look at as well. And you'll be able to see all of the recordings there of those webinars that we've done this term. And we also have one more webinar this term before we all break up for Christmas. And that is tomorrow. So you may not be able to sign up for tomorrow, but if you do, you'll also get sent a recording automatically. And that's going to be my colleagues Zoe and Elaine, who are going to be doing an MFL SOS using film in the MFL classroom. And again, that's through the different key stages as well. We'll have our webinar schedule for spring term ready soon, so do stay tuned for that. We'll obviously have lots more going on next term as well. If you want to have a look again at what's coming up as well when that schedule is out, you can have a look at our Eventbrite page for Languagenut too. So moving on to today's webinar. Just before we get started, and I'll give you the outline of the session, it's important to let you know, obviously, that the content of this PowerPoint, for it to be fully understood, it would be useful for you to have it alongside the recording, which will obviously be available for free. And obviously, the ideas that I sort of go through today, a lot of them won't be reinventing the wheel. They're ideas that are often shared online. They're kind of things that you will have maybe seen before, but it's nice to get that refresher. And obviously, we want to thank so many people in the MFL community for sharing what they do on social media. And everything in this webinar is suggestions. It's not something you have to go away and do in your classroom. So in terms of the structure, the session, first of all, I'm going to go through some of the context. So looking at sort of the most able pupils and sort of debates around that and how that might look in your MFL classroom. And then we'll go on to some sort of practical tips and ideas for activities that you can do to stretch your high achievers in MFL at Key Stage 3, 4 and 5. And hopefully towards the end, we'll have some time for a Q&A. I'm not sure how many people we've got here in terms of experience, numbers of years of teaching. So again, also if you pop in the chat how long you've been teaching for, it's really interesting for us to know how to tailor these sessions. If we've got lots of obviously early years teachers, or that do sessions more geared towards that. But obviously, if you've got lots and lots of years of experience, this is also hopefully quite useful for you too. So if you are an early teacher, early careers teacher, you should be quite familiar, we should all be quite familiar with the teaching standards. Obviously this stretching and challenge our high achievers falls into the teaching standard 5. And I've highlighted that sort of last bullet point, where it's making sure that we're adapting our teaching to respond to the strengths and needs of all pupils, and in this case pupils of high ability. Obviously there is a debate surrounding the highly able or the gifted label. And we sort of understand, obviously, that there's no one-size-fits-all method for determining whether a child merits this label, and we'll be talking about that a little bit more later. High ability and most able has come to sort of replace that gifted and talented term that was used, I know was at least used when I was at school. So first of all, having a little look at the national context of sort of what Ofsted deems to be a most able student, and also the kind of national context of how those students are achieving in the UK. So you can see I've got some quotes up here from the most recent sort of deep dive that Ofsted did on most able students. And this was written in 2015, and that itself was an update on a report that was done in 2013. And so the main takeaway from this report seems to be that in general, your most able girls across all subjects, this is not necessarily just languages, your most able girls tend to outperform your most able boys. And also your sort of most able students from more disadvantaged backgrounds and more disadvantaged areas tend to underperform in comparison to their peers in more privileged areas. We also see the Key Stage 3 level coming out as the level at which lots of your sort of most able students sort of fall by the wayside because they're not necessarily being challenged enough and they're sort of repeating work that they've potentially done at Key Stage 2. So those are sort of the key areas where our sort of most able students are sort of finding things more difficult. Obviously that was done in 2015. I doubt the situation has changed that much at this stage, particularly not with the pandemic as well. And so obviously Ofsted used this term most able. As we move through this PowerPoint, we're going to move away from the most able term. We're going to focus on high achievers. One of the reasons for that is obviously for focusing on this fixed and growth mindset. I think it's important not to see giftedness or high ability as a fixed trait. Obviously, we get students coming into our classroom from all different backgrounds, and it sort of their processes can be different. And so, you know, somebody that comes in really able in year 7 might continue to be, but then you might also get students sort of coming out of the woodwork at a sort of year 8, year 9, year 10 even, that sort of obviously if fostered in the right way can become your high achievers. And obviously all of the different activities that we look at in the practical part of this session are sort of the kind of activities that you can use with the whole class. While they are particularly useful in terms of stretching, they can be used with all abilities, they can be used at all levels as well. So that said, we'll just look quickly now at some of the characteristics that you might notice with your high achievers in your MFL classroom. So this list is taken from this Learning to Teach Modern Foreign Languages in Secondary School by Pakla. It's something that a lot of people, if you're currently doing PGC, will have been familiar with. And this is a sort of list of generally agreed upon traits of high achieving students in the MFL classroom. One of those is that they're going to be more keen to use the target language spontaneously, more likely to be creative with it. Generally speaking as well, we've got an analytical and organised approach to language learning. So these students might well have their own sort of system for learning vocabulary. They might have their own system for noting down grammar paradigms, and they might be a bit more meticulous about that. You might also see the ability to manipulate and transfer structures, that transfer being the operative word. A lot of these students will be able to see that, yes, you've taught negatives in the context of hobbies, but they will then also be able to transfer that structure over to the topic on family, for example. You'd also see naturally strong comprehension skills and the ability to infer meaning from text and audio. You'd also see strong ability to imitate and retain target language structures, as well as pronunciation as well, and that's often tied to memory. Often high achieving students in general and also in the MFL classroom tend to be highly curious, so often you'll get those why questions, which can be quite fun when students sort of pick fights about why a certain grammar rule is how it is. And so you get lots of why questions with your high achieving MFL students, which can obviously be a really great tool in the classroom to exploit. It can also lead sometimes to some of your high achievers potentially being some of your more disruptive students, because they're wanting to know why things are happening when you want to move on to another activity. We also see with high achieving students that they often want to see grammar as a tool rather than as something that's inflicted upon them, which is why we'll talk later on about the use of paradigms. And then finally, your high achieving MFL students are often more likely to be keen to take risks with the language. So maybe not worried so much about making mistakes. If they're using a new item of grammar that you haven't necessarily taught them yet, they're more likely to want to take risks with that and want to sort of push themselves beyond what they're seeing necessarily in the classroom. So there are other traits, obviously, but those are some of the sort of more agreed upon traits. We also have, however, quite a few myths about high achieving students in general, but also in the MFL classroom. One of those myths is that high achievers don't need help and they'll do fine on their own. And one of the reasons we wanted to do the webinar tonight is because you see quite a lot of CPD, you see quite a lot of sort of top-down driven initiatives by schools to make sure that students that are struggling are supported, which obviously is important, but it is really important to make sure your high achievers are given the tools to sort of reach their full potential. And so that myth that they'll do fine on their own if left to their own devices, as long as they have the resources they need, they'll be fine, isn't necessarily true. They do need support and they do need guidance, and they need to be shown how to make the most of their ability. Another myth is that high achievers potentially make everybody else in the class smarter by being able to provide a role model. I know that some highly able students are used as helpers or teachers, and this can, with the right student, be a really nice tactic, but it doesn't necessarily work for all high achievers. It is really important for them to be able to interact with other students who are aiming high, with other students of a similar level, so that they can sort of challenge one another as well. We also see the myth that if a student isn't doing so well in their vocab test, if a student isn't doing so well or receiving poor grades, that they can't possibly be a high achiever. Obviously that feeds into the sort of idea that, you know, students can grow into their ability, they could grow into being a high achiever. Just because a student isn't necessarily motivated doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't highly able, doesn't mean that they're not potentially going to be a high achiever. We just need to find out what's going to make them tick and what's going to make them work hard enough to achieve. Also, finally, have the myth that high achievers are always happy, popular and well integrated into wider school life. And I think it's important to remember, because these are the kind of students that are maybe asking more why questions, sometimes they're also going to be the ones who are more anxious about sort of issues outside of the classroom. They are potentially going to be more likely to be wound up by their peers if they are sort of hoping to press on. And so they're not necessarily always going to be students that can just get on fine on their own. They're going to need more support. And so then to look at sort of in detail the kind of high achiever that you might see in your classroom, hopefully as we go through these, you'll be able to sort of picture in your mind's eye the kind of students that you see that fit into these different characteristics and fit into these different categories. In terms of your high achievers, you often have your all-rounders, and the students who are told that they are good in or are good at every subject. Those are the ones that are probably going to be, you know, naturally going to be able to pick up new vocab, new structures. But because they're all-rounders, they're not necessarily going to be focused on languages alone. They're not necessarily going to be the kind of students that are going to be taking multiple languages at GCSE. They're kind of students that are going to be sort of asked and sort of pulled from all angles to do all sorts of topics. So if they're not stretched, particularly early on, they are potentially going to be the ones that sort of lose interest in MFL. We also see our high achievers who are language crazy, or really crazy about their subject, and those are the ones obviously that we want to make sure we're sort of really gearing towards A-level, further study maybe as well. We then have our high potential, low engagement, so that we talked about just now, students who are highly able but aren't necessarily choosing to channel that in the right way. And then in the MFL classroom in particular, I think we have then 3 more categories of high achievers. One of those being students who've had more input at the primary level, so those who come in at Key Stage 3 having had fantastic provision at primary school, who are then sort of repeating things quite regularly throughout their first, second, third year at school. Also then have our native speakers, which I've split into 2 categories, because obviously both categories are going to be high achievers within your subject, within the language they speak. Often you also have sort of speakers of other languages. For example, if you have a Portuguese speaker in a Spanish lesson, that are going to be naturally quite good at understanding the language. But I've split them into 2 categories, because you might have your native speakers who are general all-rounders, who are sort of going to be able to, who are already sort of thriving in other subjects, and who are more likely to be the kind of students that might be able to take a GCSE or an A-level early, or even outside of school, if you are able to do that. But then we also have our native speakers, who are obviously going to be high achievers within your subject, but if they have English as an additional language, and they've maybe recently come to the country, they're not necessarily going to have the English skills to be able to access that higher level content. So it's learning to sort of stretch those students without sort of putting them in situations where their English is going to hold them back. And so hopefully we can sort of imagine all of these students, and we're going to look now at some more practical activities that can be used to help stretch them, how to help challenge them. And to begin with, we're going to look at Key Stage 3, because that's one of those areas that's been identified as an issue for students, you know, who are potentially high achievers, potentially becoming disillusioned with languages. And so in order to get students off to a flying start at Key Stage 3, it's really important that we sort of learn to foster independence in those students that are high achievers. And in the Key Stage 3 class, you might have your native speakers, you might have your students, particularly at Year 7, your students who have had a lot of experience at Key Stage 2. You might, when you're getting into sort of Year 8, Year 9, you might have big classes where you've got some students who are really pressing on, who want to do GCSE, but you've also got students who don't want to. And then you also might have talented linguists in your lessons who are also all-rounders, who are being told that they should just take one language forward, or they might be being told that they're not going to take any languages forward. And so with all of these kind of students to cater for, it is really important that your native speakers, your pupils that have that experience, that they are sort of fostering that independence, so that within a lesson, they know the kind of tasks that they can go and get on with. If you are not able with your time to sort of tell them to go and sort of go and do this, go and do that, prepare a new activity for them, it's fostering the independence so they know what to go and do if they need extra work within a lesson. So looking at that, sort of looking at some pre-prepared extensions that you can do to begin with Key Stage 3. So one thing you can do is if you're doing reading activities. So we've got an example over here on the left of a base text that could be used in this case as a comprehension. Obviously, again, apologies if you're a Germanist this evening. I am a French and Spanish teacher, so most of my examples are going to be using French and Spanish. Obviously, this would work for any language you're teaching as a second language as well. And so what I would have students do is I would have this extension options list that would be printed out and stuck in the back of their books. And so when we have an activity like this, where they might be able to go through the comprehension really, really quickly because they're not finding it too challenging, what they'd then do once they'd finished that would be to pick an extension. So there'd be two types of extension. One is to sort of create an activity using the base text, and another is an activity that would enhance the text, so sort of more writing based. And one thing that's really, really important with this is that, you know, these students, if they are doing extra work, if they are doing something that the rest of the class isn't doing, it needs to be monitored, it needs to be recognised. And so what I would quite often do with these activities is if a student creates me a gap fill or a trapdoor activity from this base text, I would then photocopy that and use that as a starter activity the following lesson for the whole class to do. So it is really important to celebrate the extra work that they're doing. And so just an example of what they would then do, so if they created a gap fill, they would then put a tick by that. And so throughout the term, you'd see, you know, where they've done those extra activities. And if they're only ever doing gap fills, you say, you know, maybe try something else. Maybe if they're never adding a tense, maybe that's something they need to work on. One thing about gap fills, when you're doing it in this kind of reverse order, is it's a really nice thing to be able to get students to tell you why they've chosen to take a word out and why they've chosen to use that word in their gap fill, to really get them thinking about, okay, did I choose it because I deliberately chose two feminine nouns, because then it's like it's harder for them to work out what the article is, or I've chosen to I form of the present tense, so that again students really need to know the meaning of that. So it's good when they're doing a gap fill like this that they can not just pick a bunch of words to take out of the text, that it's actually a stretching activity in that they're thinking, why am I doing this? Same if they produce something like a trapdoor activity. So that's where you sort of choose different words in the text. I'm sure people have seen this before. Choose different words in the text and you give different options, which then would be read out by another student. And they have to guess, once you've chosen the options that you want, they read that out. And if they get if they read that out, je voyage beaucoup avec mes amis, and that's the one that you've chosen, they can carry on. If they can't, then they go back to the beginning. So it's a really nice way of both practicing pronunciation and practicing, in this case, when they're creating the trapdoor, it's a good way of showing that they know that sort of wider grammar around those words as well. So those are two things. Obviously, if it wasn't a comprehension activity that you're doing, they could also create a comprehension activity. And as an additional challenge with that, they could write their questions in the target language. So lots of ways that you can extend that. And then also, if you want them to enhance the text, so more kind of writing-based activities, they could do a synonym check, where they go through and anytime they see a word that they could swap out with a more interesting word, they can, if they've been trained how to use a thesaurus, they could use a thesaurus to do that. They could use an online thesaurus if they've got devices. And also, particularly once you've started teaching paradigms, started teaching tenses, you could also get them to add another tense on. So in this case, obviously, we've got the present tense. Our final paragraph is talking about the past tense, and so a student might want to add one more paragraph or short bit in the near future as well. And so all of those can be done pre-prepared and done, so that if you've got the rest of the class that needs more time going through the answers of the comprehension or need more time on that comprehension, you can have these students sort of carrying on knowing, without having to put their hand up and ask you, what do I do next? I finished, what do I do next? If they've got this extension options printed out, then they can just get on with that while you're dealing with everybody together. If you are a Languagenut subscriber, or you are interested in Languagenut and how Languagenut could help with this, obviously you can. This is a great way of having extension options. If you are using Languagenut, with all of our sort of reading, listening, our exam skill activities, we've got 3 different challenge levels. So a way that you could get around that sort of within class differentiation is by, you can get students to, some of the class will be doing at 1, some of the class might be doing at level 2, some of the class might be doing level 3. And what we can do here is, when you set a class task as an assignment, you can set it not just to a whole class, but also to just individual students. So if you have a couple of students in your classroom that are going to be finishing off really, really quickly within a lesson, you can, before the lesson or within the lesson, pick a couple of tasks that are completely different or more of the same, and assign those to them. And so they can then, if they finish the base work, they can then sort of choose to get on with that. So those are some fairly within class activities that you can do at Key Stage 3. Another couple of nice things that take a bit more preparation, but can be a really nice sort of additional extracurricular almost activity that can stretch them and keep them interested, is by sort of using these. You might have a target language or authentic material box. So if you've got a department where everybody can bring back something from holiday, or if you want to print some things off from online, again, apologies for just the French example here. And you can have a box that's full of, metro tickets. You might have bus timetables, menus, food wrappers, all sorts of magazines, receipts, all sorts of things that you can put in these boxes, that can then be, the students can use the box once they finish an activity. They can go to the box and they can pick out a couple of items, and they can do all sorts of things. They can create a story around those items, like jeu de poubelle. They can have a go at translating them. They might want to create their own version. They might want to sort of write their own food packaging label in the target language. So lots of things that they can do, and use that language creatively, use those sort of resources creatively as well. And that can just be something that you prepare at the beginning of the year, and that will then do you for multiple years in a row, as long as you can trust students with the resources. Another nice thing you can set up, that again will be a little bit of work setting up, but is a nice thing that you can get sort of those high ability, high achieving Key Stage 3 students to do, is you can set up pen pal schemes. So there are various sites online which can pair your school with another school. Obviously, you'd have to check with sort of your own policies on things like safeguarding, but you can sort of set up a pen pal scheme with another school. Again, can be a whole class activity if you want to, or if you've got a student who you think would really, really benefit from using that language more creatively, maybe sort of making a link with another person, sort of that also speaks that language. It's a nice thing that you can have students sort of, if they've got a pen friend, they can maybe spend half of a lesson writing out their next letter to their pen friend as well. One more thing for sort of fostering independence, and this is also something that is useful for Key Stage 4, so moving on slightly here. I mentioned before, when we were talking about key characteristics of high achieving MFL students, is that often they have their own, slightly more potentially their own ways, and they're quite meticulous in the way that they want to organise their learning. Obviously, you will have your own policies about how exercise books need to be laid out, what needs to be in there. I'm not saying to not follow those, but one nice thing that you can do is encourage students who are really keen to do extra, perhaps those students who are going that extra mile outside of the class, or even within the class, to create their own sort of, if they have their own language journals, where they can sort of take more detailed vocabulary notes, they can take more detailed grammar notes, and they also can provide them with things like topic logs, which I think becomes even more of a thing when it gets to Key Stage 4. And within those topic logs, they can, every time they come across an interesting phrase or some interesting vocabulary on a particular topic, so we've got the example on here on the right of family, they can, either if this is online or by hand, they can then go into that box and they can copy out that sentence along with the translation, so that when it comes to their revision for something like the writing exam or a speaking exam, they can then come back and have a look at that. And again, that's something that would be great for those learners who are going the extra mile, but it's also something that could be used across the class as well. We do also have that available at A-level. We actually sort of posted a blog post the other day where we sort of prepared some pre-made topic logs for A-levels, which are slightly different. They include useful links and resources, and then facts and figures taken from those resources, and then questions about those kind of topics. So if you want to have a look at those are in our blog page, and we've got a link to that as well at the end. So if you do teach A-level and want some examples, you can have a look at, and we are probably going to be putting together some similar ones for GCSE as well, so do stand by for those. So yes, really good way of getting students to become more independent with their learning, and it's a way of you sort of following up what they're doing outside of the classroom as well. Anytime you've got students doing extra work, it should be recognised. It should be something that you are monitoring, because it's something that should be praised, and it's something that also making sure that they're not writing down absolute nonsense at the same time. So another way you can foster independence is by giving paradigms. Again, part of those characteristics that we looked at the beginning is that often high achievers, they see language and they see grammar as a tool rather than as something that is inflicted upon them. And so quite often they can find it, I know I've had students find it really, really frustrating when they've said, how would I, in a lesson where we've been doing near future tense, where they've said, well, yes, this is how I'm going to say I'm going to go. I want to talk about where I went last week. How do I do that? And if you say then, sorry, we're not doing past tense until the next term. That for a sort of high achiever, somebody who's really looking to sort of stretch themselves, can be really frustrating. And so where appropriate, it can be a really nice thing to present these students with a paradigm, as long as they've been shown how to conjugate verbs in something like the present tense, as long as they have a basic idea of conjugation, particularly with verbs, although it can also be with things like adjectival agreements, etc. It's quite nice to be able to then give them a paradigm that they can then be more creative with. And the kind of things that you can do with this once they've had a look at that is you can then use those paradigms again as potential extension activities. You can have really, really easy pre-made blank sheets where you have a checklist for grammar. And this is something that you can just have a pile of in your desk. That again, if a student gets to the end of an activity, or if you have a sort of reading that you've given them, this is just something that you can take off your desk, and you can have different levels of it. So this is a sort of feminine noun plural adjective, a sort of lower down the year groups one. You can also have ones that have sort of slightly harder, perfect tense, direct object pronouns, negative phrases. So those can be a varying level of difficulties, and you can have those ready to give to students who need stretching, who'd like to have a look for those kind of things, and you can just give it to them while you've got the rest of the class doing something else. You can also do it for A-level, so it's something that can be used at any level to get students really thinking about how to sort of isolate those different grammar items and find them in different contexts. That particular paradigm as well was taken from this link down here, so if you're interested in having a look at that, then do just ask for the PowerPoint after this. Another thing you can do with paradigms is create word clouds. Again, you can have a bunch of these that you have at hand ready to just hand out to students. They don't necessarily need to be something that you prepare specifically for a lesson. And those can be interesting words with grammatical sort of gravitas that you can give to students, and you can sort of you can give various activities. You can ask them to find the class of word that it is. So obviously they'd look at that trabajaré and they would say, okay, let me have a look at my table. That's obviously, it's an infinitive verb, it's got an ending, it's going to be the future tense. So they can tell you the class of the word, or you can ask them to create sentences using those words. So again, easy activities and easy things that you can have readily available for these students, so that you can sort of give those to them as an additional activity that doesn't necessarily sort of give them more of the same, gives them something slightly different to do within one activity. And with paradigms, again, in terms of Languagenut, if you're a subscriber, you'll know this already. If not, you can have a look. And if anybody in this webinar does fancy having a look at Languagenut as a free trial, please do just get in touch. I'll put some emails up at the end, and we can set you up on one. But in Languagenut, we do have a verb trainer. And if you get the secondary product, that means you have access to all tenses all the way through to the A-level tenses. So we've got all of the tenses that you'd need for GCSE, for French, German, Spanish, Italian and Mandarin. And then we also have French and Spanish at A level. And we have all of these verbs in here, which then students can go into those verbs. They can have a look at the endings, they can have a look at the conjugations, and then they can practice different activities that will help them learn the endings. We then also have a grammar section where students can sort of pick something like the conditional tense, see those tenses in context, and then practice them across a range of activities where, like, they've got a fridge magnet activity, we have a gap fill activity, and we also have a dictation activity as well. So lots of different ways that if you've got students that you can trust to just get on with it in their own time, you can sort of let them get on with that in their own time and have a look at those paradigms. And again, because of the fact that you have all of the tenses in the secondary product, that means that your students lower down the year groups, even those students who are in sort of year 7, year 8, year 9, if they're able to access it, they can even go in and look at those tenses earlier than they would do potentially otherwise. So moving on, a nice way to potentially get your native speakers involved, as well as your sort of Key Stage 3, 4 and 5, is encouraging reading. And a nice thing that you can do to include, sort of to improve those skills of reading for nuance, which is something that is a sort of more higher level, higher order thinking skill, is that you can get students, as long as you have a selection of different types of authentic material, you can get students, you can sort of take away all of the font and all of the formatting, and you can give students extracts of those, which they then read and they decide what type of text is this. This can also be done sort of at a higher level. If you find a particular debate or a particular topic where there are multiple sides of an opinion, you can find newspaper articles potentially which show both opinions, and you can give students two articles and get them to tell you, either in the target language or also in English, what are the two opinions being shown and what's the difference of opinions in those two articles. So nice things that you can get students to do here. And with your native speakers, again, for some of them in particular, building their literacy skills within their own language is going to be one of the key things that enables them to be able to sort of access the GCSE, access the Key Stage 5 content. So getting them to read more widely is really important, although it is really also important that you track this and that you don't just sort of say, here's a book, off you go, but that there are activities structured around that, like they're going to sort of maybe tell you what it is that they've written today, that they keep journals of that as well. So yes, we'll talk a bit more about culture later on. That's a nice kind of activity that you can do with your sort of authentic materials. And looking at sort of specific skills, ideas for within activities. So with listening and reading, sometimes you're not going to have the time potentially to sort of get a student to do a completely different activity. So there are different ways that you can obviously challenge within one. So this is just an example that you can do with listening. So we've got a basic listening activity where students listen to an activity that somebody's talking about, an opinion that they give about it. One thing that's nice and easy that you can do straight away to stretch your high achievers is to not just have the activity and the information that the activity is asking for, but also to have an additional column where they might write down anything else that they hear. Quite often, particularly with the textbooks, you hear additional information being thrown in there, particularly at higher level for distractors, so they can write down that information that they hear. If you have students as well that you know are going to be able to get everything down in their first listen through, a nice challenge would be to have the second time they listen through, get them to write down what they hear, so a little dictation. And in terms of marking that, you can actually give students their transcripts so that they can mark the transcript that they've done while also marking the main activity. And if you then need more time to go through the activity with the whole class, another nice thing that you can do, which then challenges those writing skills again, is for students who have got all of the answers correct, who have done their dictation. Another nice thing that you can do as an extension activity is to get them to write what could be the transcript for another person within that activity. In terms of how Languagenut can help with that, obviously we've got a whole section on listening, we've got a whole section on reading, writing and speaking. Within our listening, we have the ability for you to access the transcript. So you can see where I've sort of circled in green there. If you click on that, you get the transcript for the activity. And so not only does that provide you with the wealth of sort of other base text that you could use as reading activities or as basis for writing, but it's something that you could use, obviously, if you wanted to do a Languagenut activity within the lesson. That's something that you could just print off nice and easily and give to your students. Looking at some writing and how another way that you could stretch within an activity. Obviously, photo cards and photo descriptions are quite a big part of the GCSE examinations for most languages. Those skills of describing a photo are some things that can take some time to build. If you've got classes where you've got mixed ability at Key Stage 4, it might be an area where you need, some students need more input with sort of the basic photo description, whereas others need less input. So if you're doing a lesson where you're doing sort of input on the photo card and looking at photo description, and you know you've got some students who are ready to move on past that, you could get them to do different photo challenge activities. So for example, they could look at these photos, which could be the ones you're using with everybody else, and they could write out a conversation that could be happening. They could write out a little story about what they think happened before the photo was taken, what they think will happen next, what they think would happen if, for example, the lady in the bottom right said no. And so various different things that you could get students to do with stretch their writing activities, which also enable you to then continue looking at a different skill with a different part of the class. Another thing with writing is that, again, it can be really, really helpful. And I know lots of people have various different lists that they use, acronyms that they use, but obviously giving students phrases that are going to make their work stand out and making sure that they're using them is really important. I must caveat this slide with saying deliberately, these are not banks that I have made, they're ones that are available out there on the internet for free. I've included a link there. Obviously, with these kind of activities, there is no need to reinvent the wheel, particularly if you're an early careers teacher. There's no point in spending hours and hours and hours on one of these when you can adapt one that you find online. And so there are loads of really, really good writing mats out there that a lot of schools will have their own version that they stick to, a lot of which do exactly the same thing. And it's all about, with your high achievers, making sure that they're using them responsibly and that they're using them in a way that is really improving them. So one thing that I would always do if we're sort of preparing for a 90-word task where you have different bullet points is I would say, you know, prepare your bullet points as though there were 4 separate areas and make sure you use one phrase from this mat per bullet point. And get them sort of using it like that, because you don't need to use one every single time, but it's a good way of getting them used to using them. Another nice game that I would get students to do, possibly more as a revision class activity than within lesson, because it could be quite chaotic, is dice activities, where I would sort of say, okay, so the yellow dice is the topics, and I'd put sort of 6 topics on the board, and then the orange dice is the sentence structures. So I'd pick 6 sentences or phrases from the writing mat, and then you'd roll the 2 and you would have to create a sentence about the topic that you landed on using a phrase that the orange die came up with. So a nice way of getting them to sort of use that language more creatively and transfer those different phrases across different topics. Another thing you can do in a similar vein, particularly Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5, is you can make that slightly more electronic, you can make that a bit more tech, and you can use Wheel of Names to write in different types of standout phrases, and you can put an example essay question up on the board, send students the link, and again, it's a nice way that you can differentiate. You can send different levels of phrases to different students in the class and get them to spin the wheel, and whichever type of phrase they come up with, they then have to create a sentence that might be in that essay using that particular phrase. In terms of what we've got on Languagenut to enable writing skills and speaking skills, we have photo descriptions in our speaking for both A-level and secondary. So students, they can either be used as photos for your lessons, or you can get students to actually record their own answers within there. Within the A-level product, we also have writing photo descriptions based on the main topics. And we also have writing open questions for all 3 levels and all 3 ability levels within that. So loads and loads of different authentic, non-past paper questions that you can get your students, particularly your high achievers, to practice with so that they use that vocabulary regularly. And then finally, with our A-level, we've also got a whole section on general essay vocabulary that students can learn across various different activities as well. A quick note on speaking, as I know we're sort of running out of time. With your speaking, one thing that you can do with your high achievers, particularly at Key Stage 4, obviously you will have general conversations for your GCSEs. I know schools have different approaches in how they sort of prepare students for the general conversation, but a nice thing is obviously you will have some students who go away, they have lots and lots of questions that they learn straight away and they're ready to go. So with those students, rather than having them go over and over and over again, obviously it's important that they know the kind of things that they're going to be talking about in their GCSE, but it can be quite a nice thing every now and then for your high achieving Key Stage 4 students to throw them the kind of question that they might get in a A-level exam, for example. And not necessarily obviously expect them to be able to respond to it straight away, but be able to give them a question, for example, and have them go away, think about it and have a research, see if they can come up with an answer, you know, even if they are sort of at the Key Stage 4 level still. And obviously in terms of finding inspiration for those speaking questions, you can find them on Languagenut, and you can also create your own exam writing questions and your own exam speaking questions in Languagenut, which then integrate with the platform. An area that we haven't really looked at yet is cultural awareness. So again, if you want to sort of engage your learners, and this is potentially really useful for those students who are not necessarily as engaged as others, a nice thing that you can do as extension activities for your high achievers is to sort of get them developing their cultural awareness. You know, they're more likely to ask why, they're more likely to be thinking, what's the point of this? And so you can give them the point by providing that cultural background, which gives them the reason for learning. And so obviously we've got various topics that you can do, various things that you can do. This is by no means exhaustive. You can get students planning trips again, and you can decide whether this is in the target language or not, depending on the ability level and the age level. You can get them taking notes while they're on a holiday, and then they come back and they write about that holiday in the target language. You can get them at the top left hand side. It's a really interesting sort of why. You can give them this map. It's a map of areas that France had under colonial rule, and you can get them to go away and you can get them to think about these kind of bigger topics that are wider cultural issues and wider cultural points that students can go away and look at and learn about using technology, using the internet, either as homework tasks or within lesson. Another nice thing as well is tourist websites. So you can get students looking at the tourist website for Paris, looking at Madrid, Berlin, or any of the major cities in sort of languages in the countries where they teach the language that is spoken. And you can get students doing sort of Easter egg hunts within those sites. Okay, find me activities to do next week, find me activities to do over Christmas, etc. You can really use those to your advantage as well. Reading we talked about a little bit before. Again, apologies that this is just French examples, but encouraging wider reading is again a really nice way to stretch your high achievers, be that through giving them extra extracts and doing sort of grammar activities with them, or giving them books to go away and read in their spare time. Another thing as well with your high achievers for Key Stage 4 and 5 is sharing university first year texts and giving them a flavour for the kind of text that they might come across at a higher level as well. News is another big thing that can, again, I've got Key Stage 4 and 5 here, but you can also start bringing it in at Key Stage 3 as long as it's age appropriate. Sharing news stories that are relevant to them is going to be a really nice way of keeping engagement up. And again, there are lots of sort of very, very easy to prepare straight activities that you can just give to students that you can have printed off on your desk that you don't have to spend a lot of time preparing, that they can just go away and do. For example, find a fact check. Or they can do your grammar activity, or you can use them as the topic of a debate. So hopefully that's a lot of sort of practical activities and ideas of things that you could do in your lessons. One note before we sort of wrap up and do Q&A is that I know that some people, for me, I know for sure that if I'd been listening to this PowerPoint in my placement school, I would have been thinking, what happens when the behaviour is too poor in my class for me to be able to focus on everything going on at once? And obviously this is when that teaching standard 7 kind of comes into this area. Often, I think if you find that if you are able to adapt your teaching, if you're able to really stretch those students who would otherwise potentially be messing around, then you will find that your behaviour overall in the lesson is going to be a lot better. So if you have students that are genuinely occupied, independent, and not feeling bored, then you are often going to have sort of a better climate for learning and a better sort of climate within your classroom. And obviously quite often you've got those potentially higher achievers can sometimes be your most disruptive students. They've just chosen to not engage for whatever reason. And so when you do have students who have high potential but low engagement, there are a few things that obviously can help you sort of, it's again, there's no set rule for how you would bring them back in, and often it is to do with your relationships with the students and how you reach out to families. But a few ideas for things that you can do to build engagement with students who potentially aren't reaching their full potential. One of those is by giving choices. So again, sometimes if these students feel like, you know, they've been given a choice of what extension activity they might do, then that gives them a bit more power, and it gives them a bit more chance to sort of do what they feel like they want to do. Promoting competition is another thing that, again, depending on the student, sometimes can be a terrible idea to do, but again, sometimes, particularly with your high achievers, if you can show, oh look, you're doing really better, like, you know, you and this student are now, you know, in this particular piece of work are really head to head, and that can be a really nice way to sort of foster that engagement. And obviously with something like Languagenut, we get points for all of the activities that you do, which can obviously foster healthy competition between classes, between students as well. A nice thing that you can dangle as a carrot, particularly within lessons and classes where potentially your behaviour as a whole is a bit more rowdy, is the promise of collaborative work. Obviously you get students all the time being like, can I work with X, can I work with Y, and you're thinking, no, please no. But sometimes, as you know, if you build that trust and you show that you can then extend that trust to the students, you can find sometimes that with your higher achievers, if they're able to collaborate, they come up with some really lovely things. Unsurprisingly, we've got technology in here, but it is something that comes up time and time again in the blogs with your high achievers, is that giving them access to technology in order to sort of expand their interests, expand their ability using online tools, it is really important for them. And then the final thing is making sure that you set and share goals. I think one thing that I noticed was something that really annoyed certain learners that I have while I was still teaching is, you know, they'd sort of say, well, why, that why question for, you know, well, you'll see the mark scheme in 2 years time, or you will show you the mark scheme next lesson. I think it's really important to show students their mark scheme, show them what they're being judged against, so that they can sort of work for that. And so in terms of just wrapping up, before we do a quick Q&A, obviously, again, in terms of low engagement, one of the things that we've done as Languagenut is we've tried to really build engaging activities within our platform. As you've seen before, we've got different levels of challenge, so hopefully all levels can be stretched. And then we have a variety of sort of interactive games where students can sort of practice their sort of exam board vocabulary without feeling like they're being dragged through it. Vocabulary exercises that, again, are nice and fun, that they can practice across different skills, so there's lots of variety, and just general extra practice for them. So we have really tried to create something that's nice and engaging, so that hopefully your higher achievers could then go on to that and build their engagement. And so that's the end of my part of the presentation. Obviously, as I've mentioned before, if you're keen on signing up for a trial of the platform, either Key Stage 3, 4 or 5, do just drop me a message. We've also got Zoe, who will hopefully be reading out a couple of questions in a moment, and Dan, who you can also email asking for resources or about a trial. But yes, hopefully, Zoe, do we have any questions from the chat?
Yes, we do, and thanks very much to begin with, Fiona. That was really interesting. Lots of information and lots of really practical tips. I'm sure that yeah, we've all learned lots of things we can use, frankly, tomorrow morning with our students already. So that's great. Yeah, I've got a couple of questions, and while Fiona's answering these, if you've got any others that come to you, then please do write them in the chat. There's still a little bit of time. So the first one I've got is from Laura, who's asked about if you've got any advice for how to motivate her high achievers with tasks that are not just that, so that she's not just being rewarding them with more work, if that makes sense.
Yes, well, as I said, hopefully maybe that would have been answered as we went through. I do think that, you know, again, rewarding is the key there. Sometimes while sometimes you want to give them work that's going to stretch them even further, sometimes it can just feel like they're doing more work than the rest of the class. It's important that they are rewarded for anything else they do. And so yeah, sometimes you're stretching and challenging can be to do with raising that cultural awareness. It can be enabling them to go off and do a sort of a mini project where it's collaborative, and so building in opportunities where your stretch and challenge work or your extension work doesn't feel like work. So as I said, doing something like getting them to plan a trip, but where they do sort of try where possible to use the target language or use the target language versions of the websites that they're looking at. It's all sort of going to build those wider skills without feeling hopefully like additional work.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, and I think you've got lots of tips in there, so hopefully that has answered Laura's question. And the other question I've got is just, I don't have a name for this person, who said that they've got a mixed ability Key Stage 4 class. So they've got higher and foundation students in the same class. I've definitely been there myself, and they actually have to kind of learn different grammar to a different extent. So, for example, the foundation students don't really have to do the future sampler, or only perceptively. They don't have to do most of the verbs and conditional and so on. Do you have any suggestions for how you can effectively teach half the class, or the higher achievers in the class, a different grammar?
Yeah, I think it is one of the most challenging things. I've also been there when you're in that situation when you've got 2 different exam boards and 1 big class. I think trying to find sort of making it really clear through the resources that you share and through the activities that you do, what grammar is related to, which grammar is related to which exam board, and then, as I said, trying to build in if you can trust the students, if you can trust the behaviour, trying to build in tasks into your lesson where you've got, when you maybe set up one half of the class that are doing, for example, like when we talked about that writing task, where you've got one half of the class who are doing a higher activity that they're getting on with on their own, potentially in silence, be that a writing activity, which you then swap the following lesson while you then sort of really hammer in the foundation vocabulary with the other half of the class, and then maybe the following lesson swap, and then you do a sort of lesson where you're really hammering the higher level grammar with your higher tier students, while letting the foundation students getting off. I know that obviously requires a lot of trust on the part of the teacher, that the half of the class that you are getting on with the task is doing, and it's important that whatever that other half is doing then is also monitored. But trying to sort of split it like that, I think I've done in the past and has worked quite well.
Yeah, me too. And if you've got a teaching assistant, gold dust.
Yeah,
I mean, that's amazing. Or a language assistant as well. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's all the questions I've got. But if anybody thinks of any other questions, 10 seconds after you've left the webinar, which is always the way from me, then please do email Fiona or any of us at Languagenut. And also, if you're interested in a trial at all, if you've enjoyed today and found it useful, please let your colleagues know, because we want to spread the word as much as possible. And we're always happy to hear if you've enjoyed it, or if there are any particular topics that you're interested in for the next session, the next series of webinars. We are planning our next season for the spring. Otherwise, hopefully see some of you tomorrow at the film webinar with myself and Elaine. And thank you again, Fiona, for a really helpful and useful webinar.
Perfect. Thank you very much.